14. A harsh, rumbling sound shook Kara Night Shadow, dragging her from the darkness enveloping her. She inhaled, only to quickly start choking. The necromancer tried to breathe, but her lungs would not work properly. She coughed, suddenly expelling an ocean of water. Over and over, Kara coughed, each time trying to empty her lungs so that she could fill them up with life-saving air. At last, it became possible to breathe, albeit somewhat raggedly. The necromancer lay still, inhaling again and again in an attempt to try to regain some balance. Gradually, matters returned near enough to normal for her to begin to sense other things, such as the chill around her and the moisture saturating her clothes. A gritty substance in her mouth forced her to spit, and she slowly realized that she lay face down on a sandy beach. Again, the world rumbled around her, forcing her head up. Kara saw that the heavens above begun to fill with storm clouds, much like those of the tempest through which the king's shield had sailed. In fact, she suspected the clouds above had to be the precursor of the same storm, now ready to sail much of the eastern coast. Memories began to return. Memories of Captain Geronin in battle with the Revenants. Then the two undead dragging the necromancer through the portal and into the raging sea. After that, however, she could recall nothing whatsoever. How Kara had survived, she could not say. The enchantress did not even know what fate, if any, might have befallen Geronin and his men. It seemed as if the portal had any effect on the hull. So if the King's Shield had survived that incident, then the odds were good that the vessel would make it to Luke Lane, if it had not done so already. Kara blinked, thinking of the city, the fate of the King's Shield aside, where by Rothma had she ended up? With great effort, the soap necromancer pushed herself to a kneeling position and peered around. Her first glimpse of her surroundings told Kara little. Sand and a few hardy plants typical of a coastal environment. She saw no signs of civilization, no signs of any human touch. Ahead of her lay a high ridge, making observation further inland impossible without a bit of climb. Kara tried to avoid the inevitable by looking left, then right, but neither of those directions offered her more hope. Her only true option remained the ridge. Still feeling as if she just expunged both of the twin seas from her system, Kara forced herself to her feet. She knew that she could have removed most of the wet clothing, but the notion of being discovered by any locals while without much to wear did not appeal to her. Besides, other than the wind, the day itself seemed fairly warm. If she moved around for a while, surely her garments would dry. Of St. Trist or Fotzen, she saw no sign, but by no means did Kara think herself rid of the two ghouls. Most likely they had all become separated in the fearsome waters for all she knew. The duo had washed them up farther down the coast. If so, it behooved the necromancer to reach Lukolain as quickly as possible. Perhaps even look for this Vigerai they had mentioned, this Drognin. She doubted that he willingly worked with the undead. Likely they sought the use of his knowledge in order to find their former friend. Whatever the case, Drognin also represented her best chance of not only freeing herself from any bond from the Revenants, but also locating Norik Vizeran. With some struggling, the enchantress made it to the top of the sandy ridge, and there discovered a well-worn road. Better yet, as she looked to the south, she noticed a dim shape on the horizon. A shape Kara believed resembled a city. Lutgolain. With as much eagerness as her weary mind could muster, she started south. If, as she suspected, Lutgolain lay ahead, it would likely take her a good day to travel that far, especially in her condition. Worse, hunger already gnawed at her stomach. a condition that only grew worse with each step she took. Nevertheless, Kara did not even think of giving in to her weakness. So long as she could walk, she would continue on with her mission. However, Kara had journeyed only a short distance when a clatter behind her made the weary necromancer pause to look over her shoulder. To her relief, she spied two well-laden wagons making their way from the north. A bushy-bearded old man and a heavy-set woman, and, at first, a younger, wide-eyed youth. A girl, most likely his sister, guiding the second. A family of merchants, no doubt, on their way to sell their wares in the thriving metropolis. The exhausted necromancer paused, hoping that they would have pity on the bedraggled wanderer. The elderly man might have driven his team past Kara, but his wife took one look at her and made him stop. They exchanged words with one another for a few moments. Then, in the common tongue, the woman asked her, "Are you all right, young one? What's happened to you? Are you in need of help?" Almost too tired to answer, the necromancer pointed towards the east. "My ship. She need not said more. A sad look came over the elderly woman's round face, and even the man gave her sympathy. Anyone living or traveling this near the sea surely knew of its violence. No doubt this had not been the first time the merchants had learned of some seafaring disaster. The husband leapt down with agility that belied his age. As he approached, he asked, "Is there any more? Are you the only one?" "There is no one else. The ship may be alright. I was washed overboard." His wife made a tisking sound. "You're still so too, young one. Your clothes are in tatters. Hestia, find her a blouse and a warm blanket. Those at least she should have at once. Hurry!" Unwilling to accept any charity, Kara fumbled at her belt. To her tremendous relief, the pouch in which she kept her money had somehow managed to remain intact. "I will pay for everything, I promise." "Rubbish!" remarked the husband. But when she insisted on thrusting some coins in his hand, he nonetheless took most of them. Hestia, the daughter of the merchants Reuben and Jamelia, brought garments that Kara could only believe had belonged to the girl herself. Clearly with an eye toward respecting this stranger's dour garb, she had chosen a black blouse and even a gray knit blanket for which Kara could cover herself. Out of eyesight of Reuben and Kara and his son and Renewal, she changed, feeling much better out of the soaked and ruined clothing. Kara regretted the loss of her cloak even more once she had put on the blouse. Although in keeping with her taste and color, it too fit tight and had been cut too low. Yet she said nothing, knowing that it had been the best choice available, and, more important, something offered to her out of genuine concern. That she had insisted on paying for it did not take away from that. To her relief, Jamili and Kara rode in the first wagon. Old enough to appreciate women, Ranul eyed her with casual interest in the beginning, and far more pointed interest once the enchantress had dried herself off and changed clothing. She expected no harm from him, but did not want to encourage anything that might cause dissension between herself and her rescuers. And so, with the help of the kind merchant family, Kara Nightshadow managed to actually reach Lucalane more than an hour before sunset. She thought of immediately going to the port to see if Captain Geronin had arrived, but the urgency of her quest finally made her decide against it. The hunt for Norik Bizarin in Bartek's armor remained paramount. In the gaily colored bazaar, she bid farewell to Jamili and her family. Kara returned the blanket with thanks, then searched the marketplace for someone for whom she could buy an inexpensive but serviceable cloak. Doing so used up another valuable hour. But with the hooded garment, the necromancer no longer felt so vulnerable. Kara would have replaced some of her other clothes as well, but her funds, much depleted, needed to be preserved now for food. Questioning the locals carefully brought the Dark Mage some information concerning the mysterious Drognin. He seemed to live in an old building some distance into the massive city. Few visited him, save to purchase elixirs and such. The only time Drognin left his sanctum looked to be when he made excursions to various scholars seeking information on some pet passion of his. Following the directions of a vegetable seller who had, on occasion, supplied the Vajera with supplies, Carl winded her way through the maze-like streets. The multitude of noises and bright colors wreaked some havoc on her senses, but she managed not to lose her way more than twice. Every so often, the necromancer asked a bypasser if she had seen a man clad in red armor, but not once did anyone say that they had. Her kidnapping and near drowning in the sea had left her bereft of nearly all her belongings. Other than the pouch in which she had kept her money, the only two others had survived. Unfortunately, the powders and chemicals in both had been ruined, save for a couple vials of no use to her at the present. Amazingly enough, the icon of Trangao remained around her throat, for which she thanked the great dragon. It gave her some comfort in this strange land. The loss of her belongings did not mean that Kara could no longer cast spells, but it did limit her somewhat. Fortunately, her change in garb had so far kept anyone from realizing her calling, even if it had encouraged one or two vendors to try to offer her more than information. Necromancers were not favored in Luke Lane. The Church of Zakharum, powerful in the kingdom, frowned on their existence, even more than it did that of the Vajerai, who were evidently tolerated here by the young sultan. One or two acolytes from the church had crossed her path so far, but, other than brief glances, they had not paid any attention to the slim young woman. With much of what remained of her funds, Kara had purchased enough to carry along with her so that she could eat while searching for Drogden. The notion of confronting a skilled, experienced Vajera bothered her enough, but to do so nearly ready to collapse would have been foolhardy at best. She could not assume that their encounter would necessarily be a friendly one. Animosity had long existed between the two callings. A trio of soldiers on mounted patrol rode past, their eyes stern, and their swords always near at hand. The foremost, evidently the officer in charge, rode a magnificent white stallion, while his two subordinates each had brown, well-muscled beasts of their own. Kara had ridden little in her life, but realized as she watched them that if the trail led outside of Luca Lane, she would have to find some means of obtaining a horse. The Dark Mage could not rely on any travel spell out in the deserts of Aranak. Even in her far-off homeland, Kara had heard tales of its deadly nature. Her surroundings suddenly grew decrepit and dank, a complete contrast to the well-kept areas she had first encountered. Kara cursed herself for not having parted with her remaining coins for a usable dagger. The one Captain Geronin had loaned her, while aboard the King's Shield, had been lost at sea. The enchantress began concentrating on her spells, inwardly hoping that she would still have enough strength to cast them should the situation prove dire enough. The necromancer came at last to the old building the vendor had somewhat vaguely described. Despite its decayed appearance, Kara immediately sensed forces at work in and around it. Some felt extremely ancient, surely even more ancient than the edifice itself. Others seemed more recent, including a few that had to have been summoned not that long ago. Climbing the outer steps, Kara looked over the ruined doorway, then stepped inside, and found herself standing in a time-worn but still magnificent hall that spoke of the glories of another time, another place. While also projecting a sense of long-ago abandonment, the high-columned hall had nothing else in common with its decrepit exterior. So much so that Kara even felt tempted to step outside again to see if perhaps she had somehow entered the wrong building. Here stood no ruin, but rather an ancient wonder, still filled with the memories of greatness, of a splendor that even modern Luco Lane had not yet approached. The necromancer walked slowly through the hall, her mission still in mind, but her attention distracted by the awesome marble columns, the imposing stone fireplace that covered nearly all of one far wall, and the massive mosaic floor upon which she cautiously tread. The floor, in fact, ensnared her attention more and more as Kara walked. In it, the artisan had captured intricate images, both fanciful and real. Dragons curled around trees. Lions gave chase to antelope. Fearsome, stony warriors clad in breastplates and kilts did battle with one another. Something clattered further down the hall. Kara froze, her gaze shifting that direction. Yet despite her excellent night vision, she could only make out a shadowed doorway at the far end. The necromancer waited, hesitant to even breathe too loudly. However, when no new noise came, Kara exhaled, realizing that in this ancient edifice, bits of marble and stone would on occasion fall free. Even the slightest sound echoed here. And at that moment, something behind her scraped across the marble floor. She spun about, suddenly certain that the revenants had followed here, and now chosen to reveal themselves. Against them, Kara could truly do nothing, but that did not mean that she would not struggle. They had already done too much, taken too much. However, instead of the ever-grinning Satan Trist and his sorceress companion, what greeted her eyes proved to be something even more startling. The gray figure wielding the sturdy blade moved slowly but surely toward her, his intentions quite clear. Kara might have taken him for some brigand who had waited in the shadows for her, if not for the fact that she recognized him from a few seconds earlier. Of course, even if Kara had not recognized the newcomer, she certainly could make out the many tiny squares of stone composing not only his entire breastplate and kilt, but also his very skin. The mosaic warrior stalked her, his savage expression exactly the same as it existed, only as a decoration set in the floor. He swiped at her with the blade, revealing that while he had the height and width of a living creature, he had no more depth to his form than the tiny stones from which he had been created. Not for a moment, though, did Kara think this any weakness. The magic that had created such a guardian would not have made him so fragile. Physically striking the mosaic warrior would likely just be like striking a stone wall. She also suspected that the blade would cut just as well, if not better, than a real one freshly sharpened. But what had set him into action? Surely Drogden did not set out such a welcome for everyone who walked through the door. No, more likely Kara had been identified by some hidden spell as a necromancer, a dark mage of unknown loyalties. She knew of such detection spells, and also knew that many mages utilize them for their own safety. Had Kara not suffered through so much of the late, the enchantress felt certain that she would have recalled such information earlier, when it might have prevented this deadly encounter. Rattling came from the floor just behind her macabre assailant, and to the necromancer's consternation, a second warrior arose to join the first. Kara then turned quickly to her right, where yet more noise marked the awakening of a third. "I mean no harm," she whispered. "I seek your master." They even served Drogden? Carlio assumed that she had come to the right place. Perhaps someone the enchantress had talked to earlier had recognized her for what she was, and sent her here to die. Many, especially those of the Zakarum faith, would have considered the loss of a necromancer no loss at all. The first of the mosaics had nearly come within the striking range of his sword. Kara saw no other choice but to take the offense. The words of the spell tripled off her tongue as the necromancer clutched the icon of Trangao and pointed at the first of her attacker. At the same time, Kara stepped back as a precaution. If her spell worked, the incredible forces she summoned might not be contained by the destruction of the magical guardian. A swarm of toothy projectiles formed in thin air, then rained down on the nearest of the mosaic warriors. The Den Drag, or Teeth of the Dragon, Trangao, ripped through the squares, sending small pieces everywhere. The warrior tried to move, but his legs and arms, now missing so many pieces, crumbled. Still wearing his scowl, he attempted one last thrust at her, and then collapsed in a shower of stone. Kara exhaled, relieved to be rid of at least one adversary, but praying she still had enough strength to deal with the others. Summoning the Den Trag had taken much already out of the wary necromancer. Yet, if Kara could not do it twice more and thus completely eliminate her unliving foes, then perhaps she could rest afterwards. Once again, the necromancer clutched the icon tight, muttering the spell. A few words more and an intense rattling around her caused Kara to falter. She glanced down, saw the many bits of mosaic stone from the fallen warrior now rolling toward one another, gathering in a swiftly growing pile behind the others. To her horror, first the feet, then the legs reformed. Bit by bit, the stone warrior rebuilt himself, none the worse for her destructive spell. The teeth of Trangao had failed her. Stepping back, Kara entered the darkened hall leading to the doorway. She had other spells at her command, but combined with her weakness and the enclosed surroundings, none of them seemed likely to help her quickly enough without risking her own life further. Rokos Diasia! The ungodly trio paused at the cry. Then each warrior abruptly collapsed, the individual stones dropping to the ground with a harsh clatter that echoed throughout the ancient structure. The stones, however, did not rest where they lay, but rather began to quickly roll back to where the figures had originally been set in the ground, each bit of mosaic returning to its precise location. One by one, they fell into place. Within seconds, the menacing fighters had not only retreated from their attack, but had completely reformed as images on the elegant floor. Kara turned to thank her rescuer, certain that had to be the enigmatic Drognin. "I thank you for your aid." The figure that stood before her could hardly be the venerable, elegantly clad Vajra the vendors and others had described. Advanced age seemed the only thing this wild-eyed beggar with long white hair and beard in common tongue with the mage in question. Although even Drognin could not be as old as this man looked. While still somewhat firm of body, his skin had grown so wrinkled and his watery blue eyes so weary that surely he had to be the oldest human alive in the world. He put a gnarled finger to his thin lips. "Hush!" the beggar whispered much too loudly. "So much evil is about! So much danger! We shouldn't have come here!" Are you Drognin?" The elderly man blinked, looked confused, then patted his worn silk robe, as if looking for something. After several seconds of this, he finally looked up and replied, No, of course not. No, hush! There's too much evil about. We've got to be careful. We've got to be on guard." Kara considered. This man had to be a servant or something similar to the mage. Perhaps Drognin even kept him here out of pity for the beggar's madness. She decided to get to the point. Perhaps enough sanity remained within the man so that he could help her with the Vajra. "Hi, I seek your master, Drognin. Tell him it concerns something of interest to him. Bartok! The ghastly change came over the beggar as he shouted the dead warlord's name. "Bartok! Bartok, no! No! The evil's come! I warned you! And at that moment, another voice called out from the entrance of the building. Who is it? Who has invaded my sanctum? The necromancer turned to speak, but the ragged man moved with amazing swiftness. He clasped a hand over her mouth and whispered, Hush! We mustn't be heard! It might be Bartok! Instead, the newcomer proved to be a Vajari, and likely the one for whom Kara had been searching. Curiously, he looked as if he had been in an accident, for he had bruises over much of his face, and seemed in discomfort each time he put pressure on his right leg. In the nook of one arm, the elderly mage carried a small package. She had no doubt that here stood Drognin, newly arrived from some errand. Norik? He called. Vizaran? He knew the man Kara hunted. She tried to speak, but for a rather spindly figure, the beggar had incredible strength. Hush! Her unwanted companion whispered. So much evil is about. We must be careful. We mustn't be seen. Drognin stepped closer, surely able to see them now, and yet he peered past both intruders, as if seeing only air. Curious. He sniffed the air, then frowned. Smells up as if the necromancer was about. But that's absurd. Drognin glanced at the floor, at the warriors in particular. Yes, absurd. He continued to stare, as if lost in thought. Not once did the mage so much as notice the struggling woman or her odd captor. At last the sorcerer shook his head, muttered to himself about another lost trail, and needed to keep searching. Then, much to Kara's dismay, walked past her and the madman. Drognin continued on, heading into the darkness, heading toward the doorway she had earlier sought, heading away from someone in desperate need of his aid. Only when he vanished behind the door did the tattered figure pull his hand from her lips. Planting his face next to hers, he whispered, We've stayed too long. We'd better go back. Been out much too long. He might find us. She knew that he did not mean Drognin. No, judging by his earlier reaction, her captor could only mean one other. Bartok. He led her along the sculpted floor to the very center where the unknown artisan had built out of the mosaic tiles an intricate temple like those that might have existed in the legendary Vizjun. Kara would not have followed him in that far, but as with the revenants, the choice of what her body did no longer remained hers. The necromancer could not even call out. Soon, we'll be safe, the madcap figure muttered to her. Soon, we'll be safe. He stomped down once with his right foot, and suddenly the doorway of the temple opened, deepened, becoming an oval hole in the floor in which the necromancer could see a set of steps leading to where? Come, come, her captor chided to her. Before Bartok finds us, come, come. Unable to do otherwise, she followed him down into the earth, down toward a distant yellowish light. As Kara stepped below the level of the floor, the enchantress sensed the sun's shifting, the image of the Vajari temple returning to its prior state. We'll be safe down here, the mad hermit assured her, seeming somewhat more calm now. My brother will never find us here. Brother? Had she heard right? Horizon? Kara blurted, surprised not only by her conclusion, but that she had now articulated it. Evidently her captor had no concerns about anyone hearing her underneath layers of rock and earth. He looked right at her, the watery eyes focused hard for the first time. Do we know each other? I don't think we know each other. When she did not respond immediately, he shrugged and continued on with the trek, still mumbling, I'm sure we don't know each other, but we might know each other. Kara Night Shadow still had no choice but to follow, not that she had much noticed at the moment. Her thoughts reeled, her world entirely turned upside down. She had not come in search of the whirlwind of Blood's armor, and found instead, even despite the many centuries that had passed since their time, Bartuk's living, breathing, and much hated brother. Incredible heat assailed North as he at last came back to his senses. At first, he imagined that a fire must have started in Drognan's sanctum, perhaps through the arcane powers of the sinister armor. However, gradually the veteran became aware that the heat, while harsh, did not burn, and in fact surely had not come from the sun itself. Rolling over on his back, Nork shielded his eyes and tried to get his bearings, only to find a sea of sand in every direction. He grimaced, wondering where he had landed now. In the distance, Nork thought he noticed darkness, as if a storm approached from that direction. Could Luco Lane lay somewhere underneath those clouds? It seemed wherever he went, the storm followed. If that were the case now, then at least he knew that he had materialized somewhere west or northwest of the coastal kingdom. But why? Drognan had said something about the armor having tricked them. How true those words had been, it had played both Vigerai and him for fools, no doubt seeking the mage's aid in locating its goal. Could that have been Horizon's tomb, as Drognan believed? If so, why had Nork ended up out here in the middle of nowhere? With great effort, the battered and worn soldier rose. Judging by the sun, he had little more than an hour or two before nightfall. The walk back to Luco Lane would take far longer than that, likely 2 days, and that providing Nork actually survived the trek. More important, he could not even be certain that the suit would let him return. If what it sought lay out here, it would do everything it could to remain in the desert. Norak took a few steps, testing the armor's resolve. When it did nothing to prevent him from heading toward the city, he increased his pace as best as he could. At the very least, Norak needed to find some shelter for the night, and the only hope of that lay in the twisted, sunset hill, rock barely visible ahead. It would take a while to reach the hill, if not longer, which meant that, despite the heat, he had to move even quicker. His legs ached horribly as Nark pushed on. The loose sand and high dunes made it tough going, and often Nork lost sight of his goal for quite some time. He even found himself turned around at one point, then swirling dunes shifting in size and direction even as he tried to cross them. Yet despite all that, the hill soon became an aspiration possible to achieve. Norak prayed that he would find moisture of some sort there. His short time in the desert had already parched him. If he did not find water soon, it would not matter whether he made it to the hill or... A large, winged shadow crossed over his own, followed immediately by a second. Norak looked up, trying to see against the sun. He caught glimpses of 2 or 3 airborne forms, but could not make them out. Vultures? Quite possible in Aranak, but these looked much larger and not quite avian in some ways. Norak's hand slipped to where his sword would have been, and once more he cursed Bartuk's armor for putting him through such horrors without a decent weapon of his own. Despite his flagging streak, the veteran doubled his pace. If he could reach the rock, it would provide him with some defense against the marauding birds. Vultures tended to be scavengers, but this flock looked more aggressive, and in some way, he could still not define unsettling. The shadows passed over him again, this time much larger, much more distinct. The creatures had descended for a better look. He barely sensed in time the feathered form dropping on him from behind. With instincts honed on the battlefield, Nork threw himself to the ground just as the talons as the great scraped across the armored back and managed to briefly snag his hair. The hardened fighter grunted as he rolled over, ready to face the birds. Surely he could scare off a few vultures, especially once he let them see he could not simply lie down and die for them. But these were no vultures. Although their ancestry had certainly come from those desert scavengers, nearly as tall as a man and with the wings and head the avian they had so resembled, the four grotesque creatures fluttered just above him, talons on both their feet, and their almost human hands ready to tear his head from his body. Their talons ended in whips, which lashed out at Nork as he desperately tried to back away. The demonic birds let out harsh cries as they tried to surround their wounded victim, cries that made Nork's pulse pound. He waited for the suit to do something, but Bartek's armor remained dormant. Swearing, Nork braced himself. If he had to die here, he would not die like a lamb because he had come to depend on the armor for so much. Nearly all his life, he had served in one war or another. This battle represented a little different. One of the monstrous vultures came within his grasp. Moving with more speed than he thought himself capable at this point, Nork seized one of the legs and threw it to the ground. Despite their size, the desert were astonishingly light. No doubt because their ancestors, their bones were designed for flight. He took advantage of that, using his own considerable mass to pin the shrieking creature down, then twisting the head as hard as he could. The three survivors harried him even harder as he rose from the limb form. But a different Nork faced him now. One who had, for the first time in many days, fought a battle of his own and won. As the second dove at him, he grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in the Fulpine horror's face. The demonic bird blindly whipped its tail at him, giving the veteran soldier a chance to seize the deadly appendage in both hands. Ah! Ah! Squawking, the creature tried to fly free. However, Nork spun the massive avian around again, driving back another pair at the same time. The talons of his captor foe scraped futilely at his gauntleted hands. Bartek's armor well protecting his host. Nork's blood surged. His attackers had come to represent to him more than simply the dangers of the desert. In many ways, they now became the brunt of all of his frustration and fury. He had suffered through too many terrible events, suffered too many horrors, and not once had been able to do anything about them. Powerful enchantments saturated the warlord's armor, and yet none of them obeyed him. Had it been to his command, he would have used the sorcery of the suit to roast the demonic beast he now held, turn it into his dire companions into fireballs. His gloves suddenly glowed bright red. Eagerly, Nork eyed them, then stared at the vulture demon. Yes, a blazing inferno. He grabbed the furious avian by the neck. The savage beak tried to tear out of its face, only increasing its determination to end this battle as quickly and decisively as possible. Nork glared at the monster. Burn! With a garbled shriek, the winged terror burst into flames, perishing in an instant. Wasting not a second, the fighter threw the fiery carcass into the nearest of the two survivors, setting that one aflame too. The last of the avians quickly turned about, flying away as if the hounds of hell pursued. Nork paid its retreat no mind, content to finishing off the third. Its feathers seared away, it tried to emulate its surviving comrade, but it had already suffered too much injury. Unable to do more than rise a foot or two above the ground, it could not escape the vengeful fighter. Nork seized the one by the wing, letting the now pathetic monster claw at his breastplate while he took it by the head. One quick jerk, snapped its neck. In truth, the battle had only taken a minute or two, but in the short span the veteran soldier had transformed. As he dropped the feathered corpse to the sand, Knaak felt a thrill such as he had never experienced in any war. Not only had he triumphed against the odds, but for once the cursed armor had obeyed him. Knaak flexed the fingers, truly admiring the workmanship of the gloves for the first time. Perhaps the encounter with Drognin had changed everything. Perhaps now that which had driven the armor to such lengths had finally given in, had even accepted its host as its master. Perhaps he could test it. Surely after all he had seen to do, the armor could perform one basic task to his command. "Alright," he growled. "Listen to me! I need water and I need it now!" His left hand tingled, twitched slightly, as if the armor wanted to take control, but sought permission. "Do it! I order you!" The glove pointed to the ground. Knaak knelt, allowed his index finger to draw a circle in the sand, and then drew a looping pattern around that circle. With small crosses in each loop, words of power erupted from his lip, but this time Knaak welcomed them. The entire pattern suddenly crackled, miniature arcs of lightning playing between one end of the design and the other. A tiny fissure opened up in the center. Clear, sparkling water bubbled to the surface. Knaak eagerly bent down, sipping his fill. The water felt cool, sweet, almost as if instead he drank wine. The thirsty fighter savored each swallow until at least he could sip no more. Leaning back, he took a handful and spilled it on his face. The soothing moisture trickled down his chin, his neck, and into his hot garments. "That'll be enough," he finally said. His hand waved over the tiny spring. Immediately the ground healed itself, sealing the fissure and cutting off the flow of water. Remain on the sand quickly sank out of sight. A feeling of jubilation washed over Knaak, causing him to laugh out loud. Twice now the armor had served him. Twice now he had been the master, not the slave. Spirits lifted, he headed again for the hill. Now Knaak, no longer worried about whether he would survive the desert. What could he not survive? If the enchantments obeyed him, for that matter, what could he not accomplish? No one had seen such mights as the armor wielded since the days of Bartok. With it, Knaak could make of himself a commander instead of a foot soldier, a leader instead of a follower, a king instead of a peasant. The image enticing him. King Knaak, ruler of the survivors. Knights would bow before him. Ladies of the court would seek his favor. Lands would come under his control. Riches beyond belief would be his to spend. King Knaak, he whispered. A smile once again spread across his face. A smile not at all like any Knaak Vizeran had advised before in his life. In fact, although he could not know it, Knaak's smile resembled almost exactly the smile of another man. One who had lived long ago, long before the former mercenary. A man named Bartok.